Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the previous video where I look into the question of the fossil fuel, the fertilizer crisis in the global south in the context of the Israel and US aggression on Iran and Iran's retaliation to that. So, my name is Dr. Norita Roy Chaudhary. I have a PhD in law and development where I specifically focused on climate change adaptation by working with farmers organizations and farming communities in the eastern part of India. So the part 2, which is titled What Cuba Did When Oil Ran Out in the 1990s and Lessons from Sri Lanka's very recent debt and economic crisis. So there is a very interesting book I read during my doctoral research, which is the book is titled Sustainable Agriculture and Food Security in an Era of Oil Scarcity, written by agroecologist Julia Wright, which looks at how Cuba adapted its food system through state-supported, localized organic farming after the collapse of the Soviet bloc between 1989 and 1991, when it abruptly lost access to fuel, machinery and agrochemical inputs that had sustained its industrial agriculture. So between 1990 and 1993, the book notes that the availability of pesticides and fertilizers fell around 80%, while fossil fuel supply dropped by 47% for diesel and 75% for petrol. Electricity levels also fell by 45%. So I'm giving these statistics to sort of give a context of the geopolitical context that shaped the crisis and thereafter Cuba's response to handling that crisis. So based on fieldwork conducted in Cuba between 1999 and 2001, Julia Wright shows how this period led to a distinct agroecological transition. Even though petroleum and food imports began increasing again afterwards, the 1990s experience in Cuba serves as an important lesson for the global south for addressing today's petro-based agricultural crisis, namely the fertilizer shortage frenzy. It's really a frenzy because you look at the mainstream news and they are all like, yeah, it's really horrible for global south farmers, which is very true. Please do not get me wrong. The global south farmers are going to pay the maximum price to any form of crisis because they were forced to depend on this entire input-based agricultural system. But offering no solutions is not the way out from this crisis. So anyway, in this video particularly, I will discuss very specifically 6 proposals that worked for Cuba based on my reading of that book. And these 6 proposals are meant to offer inspirations for organic and sustainable transition in the global south countries. And Cuba is very much within the global south context in relation to several years of the socialist country fighting US imperialism and ongoing and the contemporary US-led sanctions on Cuba, sanctions imposed in terms of its oil supply being cut. So what are those 6 proposals? First, the state in Cuba implemented radical land reforms and institutional decentralization by breaking down large state-owned plantations into smaller worker-owned cooperatives known as the UBPC, or the Basic Units of Cooperative Production. These These farmers' cooperatives linked farmers to the land, enabling crop specific knowledge and crop diversity that is essential for organic farming while still operating within a centrally planned system. Second, Cuba socialized the legal infrastructure, that is, access to land. Cuba socialized the legal infrastructure, that is, access to food was treated as a public right and public good rather than left to the private market. There was no unregulated private sector or social promotion of self-interest that could contradict these efforts. The transition was further supported by long-term investments in health, education and housing, along with a centralized rationing system established in 1962, which ensured equitable access to basic food at very low costs. On page 123, the author writes that the country anchored its human right to adequate food on socialist principles, which is a transformative approach to conceptualizing rights against profit and self-interest based motives. Even though the shift to organic agriculture occurred through forced scarcity, that is, it occurred by default, rather than a cohesive legal framework, the understanding of rights as a social structure, according to me, helped ensure that food and socially necessary rights were materially supported through collective economic systems and institutions rather than left to private market forces. Third, the country decentralized food production by localizing agriculture within urban centers to overcome fossil shortages and reduce transportation, because transportation also requires fossil fuels, right? So organic farming obviously came with reduced crop yield, which is why farms were scaled up horizontally across rural and urban areas. By granting citizens tax-free access to unused urban lands, Cuba enabled the creation of over 26,000 urban gardens in Havana by 1998. Imagine. So nice. Fourth proposal. Cuba's organic revolution was spearheaded by the scientific community. The country mobilized its existing human capital by redirecting scientists towards alternative technologies to produce organic pesticides and fertilizers. So while the book also alerts us to the criticisms against Cuba's overemphasis on scientific methods of agricultural farming, because that also meant marginalization of traditional farmers' knowledge, but that understanding gradually came through working with the local farmers, and there was also space for addressing those critiques by against the overemphasis on modern science. But this is what I'm trying to say is the scientific community at that moment of crisis did help in the way the country mobilized its research on biofertilizers and biopesticides. Fifth, the country's agricultural system revived the importance of traditional farmers' knowledge. For example, tractors were replaced with teams of oxen due to fuel shortages, which required drawing on knowledge of older generations for handling livestock and using the livestock dung to produce compost compost fertilizers. The Cuban experience overall shows that we need to decolonize our imagination first and look for socialist and collective geographies of hope beyond Western countries and beyond capitalism, to prioritize food systems based on sustainability, collectivism, equity, and redistribution. The post-petroleum food and farming system involves scaling up more localized and organic farming systems away from petrochemical inputs. The concept of localization, as the author writes, is characterized by community self-reliance as far as practicable, diversified local economies, and living in harmony with nature. Localization was achieved through short production and consumption supply chains. Food sufficiency was also closely tied to the country's food sovereignty, which in turn linked to political and economic independence. In practice, this meant that chemical fertilizers were replaced with organic fertilizers. For example, nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers were replaced with nitrogen-fixing crops, and human sewage was recycled as fertilizers. On the other hand, now coming back to another case study, in April 2021, the Sri Lankan government under Gotabaya Rajapaksa abruptly banned the import of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, aiming to transition the country to fully organic agriculture away from import-heavy agricultural system to cope with the fuel and debt crisis. This policy was framed as an austerity measure implemented amid a massive foreign exchange crisis and mounting external debt. The crisis itself was driven by long-standing relations of financial imperialism via the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which compelled Global South nations, including Sri Lanka, to privatize public healthcare, education, and social services to facilitate their integration into the world trade or the world capitalist system and into corporations and institutions controlled by USA. The sudden ban in Sri Lanka however, ban of fertilizer import ultimately backfired, followed by widespread protests by small-scale farmers simply because their livelihoods were threatened and they were not trained to prepare for an alternative to the import-heavy and petro-based agricultural system. The problem was a failure in governance tied to debt, colonialism, and international financial institutions, not a failure in organic farming. We can also not blame the farmers, the small-scale farmers, for protesting against this abrupt legislation passed by the Sri Lankan government to deal with the crisis and ban the import of fertilizers, simply because the farmers were not even consulted and they were not aware of the actual problem of what was going on, and they were not trained to deal with the transition to organic farming. And this is very important to keep in mind in order to avert from a crisis-driven policy and legislature framing, because that's going to backfire on the ground. So overall, while the Cuban experience involved many imperfections, as also acknowledged by the author, now coming back to the book on sustainable agriculture, acknowledged by the author Julia Wright, particularly given that the 1990s transition in Cuba was largely crisis-driven or organic by default, rather than being driven by a conscious mindset shift from industrial agriculture to a localized and sustainable one. It nevertheless offers a strong example of radical hope beyond the ideology of capitalist growth through a transition away from fossil imperialist agricultural system, even under conditions of scarcity. At the same time, Cuba today is not energy sovereign, with approximately 95% of its electricity still generated from imported oil, as well as domestically produced oil and natural gas, which continues to make its food system partially petro-based. It is also a case study highlighting centralized planning that may not work for huge subcontinents like India. Yet it demonstrates the possibilities of restructuring food systems through collectivism, localization, and state support for socialist principles, not principles of hate against the Dalits, the Muslims and the Adivasi peoples. The Sri Lankan experience, on the other hand, under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, shows that transitions away from fossil imperialism cannot come through a crisis-driven mindset or abrupt legislative bans with zero consultation with the working class, namely the peasant or the small-scale farmers, who have been structurally forced to depend on agricultural imports and chemical fertilizers and pesticides for decades under International Monetary Fund and Green Revolution policies, driving the country to immense debt crisis. So we cannot ignore the structures of financial imperialism and debt colonialism. Today, people are demanding justice and honest methods of being heard, along with radical and experimental approaches to democracy beyond vote-based tokenist representation. We have to figure that out together. We have to figure new ways of understanding and actualizing democracy. But old ways of thinking, ruling, threatening and dominating and passing legislations, even with good intentions, are not going to work. Today, for example, Iran is teaching the global South how to rise and stand up together against US imperialism and against the Israeli genocidal regime. So with that, I would like to end this video, but I would also be interested in hearing your comments in case you have some interesting books or interesting papers and interesting blogs or any takes that you have on Cuba and on other ways of thinking about a post-crisis based thinking about transition to organic farming or other ways of thinking about democracy. Please put them in the comments. And if you ask me, if you post dumb comments like where did I buy my earrings or what these things are made of, they are not offensive. I will simply not answer those questions, because this channel is not about sharing the color of my earrings or the origins of my fashion choices. And I think it's important to understand the purpose of this channel and respect each other's boundaries. And with that, I would like to end this video with a good thought of let's stay hopeful, and even if you watch doom and gloom news, please also look for solutions to address this crisis, but also do so carefully from a global South perspective and with a proper understanding of fossil imperialism. And anyway, until then, signing off for today. Peace.